Nasdormu allowed a sight to pass through his maw as he sensed Chronormu approaching his lair. While he was fond of all members of his flight, and Chronormu in particular did good work in her role as an investigator of temporal anomalies, she only ever approached him to speak of matters of importance. Forcing himself to wake up completely, Nasdormu rose from where he had laid down to sleep and prepared himself for the coming conversation. Ever since the significant change in the future of the timeline that took place several years ago, the Infinite Dragonflight had redoubled their efforts to corrupt the time stream. Things were beginning to return to normal now that they had realized that the Bronze Dragonflight remained powerful enough to stop them, but that did not change the fact that he had been given little chance to rest over the past few years. Shaking the sand from his scales, Nasdormu glanced at his lair filled with priceless artifacts that he had collected from throughout the time stream. All of the artifacts had already played their role in history, so collecting them would do no harm to the time stream. Even he needed a hobby, and collecting artifacts was something that amused him and helped ease the burden on his shoulders. With a quick application of his magic, Nasdormu transformed into his mortal guise. Where before stood a dragon, now stood a doll called Oi who possessed wise blue eyes, long brown hair, and was wearing a regal set of bronze-colored robes. Chronormu seemed to prefer her mortal form, and gnomes were far too small for him to comfortably speak to while wearing his true skin. Nasdormu did not have to wait very long before a female gnome that looked quite exhausted walked through the entrance to his lair. "Master Nasdormu," said Chronormu, offering a respectful bow. The Infinite Dragonflight have been repelled from their attempts to disrupt Medivh's opening of the Dark Portal, and their attacks on the merchant ship traveling to Northrend have been defeated. "Good," said Nasdormu tiredly. "Hopefully they now realize that the significant shift in the future does not mean that our flight is weakened or that they can attack the time stream unopposed." "I hope that is the case, Master Nasdormu," said Chronormu, sounding equally as exhausted. "Things have been difficult these past few years and a bit of rest would be appreciated. Has there been any progress in discovering the source of the change in the timeline?" "Some, but not as much as I hoped for," said Nasdormu, doing his best to suppress his annoyance. While some members of his flight believed that he knew everything there was to know about what was and will be, Nasdormu knew that was far from the truth. He was excruciatingly aware that there were many extremely powerful entities throughout the cosmos that had the ability to either deceive him or hide things from his vision. The old gods in particular, as sealed as they were, often used their power to disrupt the timeways and hide certain events by making it difficult for him to discern the truth by making false paths seem more real than they should. There was also the Burning Legion, who possessed powerful fell magics and existed in the Twisting Nether, a realm through which time passed differently. Nasdormu knew more about the past and the future than any other being on Azeroth, but he was not a god. He was not Lord Amanthil. Perhaps things would be different after the power that he had imbued into the dragon soul was returned to him and he had fully regained the gift that Lord Amanthil had given him, but for now, he had many powerful rivals. However, Nasdormu was starting to believe that they were not responsible for the changes in the future as he had initially believed. He had come to this verdict after concluding that the changes to the future were simply too favorable to the fate of Azeroth. Of course, that wasn't to say that all of the changes were good, but they were certainly preferable to what existed before. While I have not been able to discover exactly what influenced one of the Nerubians to come into contact with members of the Eastern Kingdoms, I have concluded that neither the Old Gods nor the Burning Legion are likely to be the source, said Nasdormu solemnly. For the first few years after the change, he had worried that it was some form of a complicated plot by the Old Gods, but recent investigations had revealed that to be unlikely. Really? Chronormu exclaimed in surprise. Then what could have possibly caused it? I know not, said Nasdormu with a hint of worry. Perhaps I will be able to answer that question in the near future, but my paths for investigation have been exhausted for now. While much of the future had changed, the destruction of the dragon soul in the near future and the return of his full power were still fated to happen, even if the details of the event had changed. Nasdormu and Chronormu continued to speak more about the changes to the timeline and the increased activity of the Infinite Dragonflight, but it soon became obvious to him that her concerns had not been fully alleviated. What worries you so much, Chronormu? Asked Nasdormu, hoping that he could find a way to ease her worries. Nothing, Master Nasdormu. It's just that you seem to be much less concerned about the changes in the timeline than the rest of our flight, Chronormu said hesitantly. Why is that? Nasdormu withheld a sigh as he considered how to answer her question. Truthfully, this was not the first time that something unexpected had occurred in the timeline, and he had long since learned to roll with the punches, to borrow a human term. However, there were many in the flight who believed him to be infallible, especially among the younger members, and thought that there was nothing that could escape his sight. He had tried his best to disabuse them of this notion, but it didn't help that he was vastly more powerful than the majority of his flight. Chronormu, time itself is, from a certain perspective, an illusion, said Nasdormu after he finished organizing his thoughts. The only true reality is the now, the present moment in which we live. Every past moment is a memory and every future moment is a hope or fear that has not yet manifested. The bronze dragonflight is responsible for protecting the timeways from corruption. It is not our responsibility to control the path through which it flows. I will continue to search for the source of these changes, but given that it does not seem to be a result of attempts to corrupt the timeways, I do not see a need to be overly concerned. Nasdormu waited several moments as Chronormu seemed to process his words. I understand, Master Nasdormu, said Chronormu after a few moments of silence. I will try my best not to worry too much about this matter. Good, said Nasdormu approvingly. Remember, Chronormu, time is a tangled web. Try not to dwell on the loose ends, said Chronormu with no small amount of exasperation. Nasdormu couldn't help but smile as he saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. I must have heard you say that phrase thousands of times since I first heard it as a whelp, Master Nasdormu. I would not need to say it so much if you all listened the first time, Nasdormu said chidingly. From there, the conversation went on for a while longer before Chronormu excused herself and began making her way out of his lair, looking noticeably more relieved than when she first entered. Once she left, Nasdormu shed his mortal skin and returned to where he had been sleeping before, intent on resting while he still had the opportunity. After all, the future was starting to look busy for him, and he would prefer to get as much rest as he could before his coming confrontation with Nelthorion. Warchief, I bring you news of Gul'dan, said Drak Earthsplitter as he approached Ogrim Doomhammer, leader of the Horde. The Warchief of the Horde was an impressive figure, larger and more imposing than any other orc that Drak had seen. Doomhammer was currently sitting in the ruined dining hall of one of the destroyed Human Kingdom's nobles, enjoying a feast with many of the orc leaders that made up the Horde. Stormwind was a hard-won victory, and many orcs were eager to enjoy the spoils of war. What is it, Earthsplitter? Has that traitor finally awoken? Asked Ogrim eagerly. Drak knew that the Warchief was eager for the Warlock to awaken so that he could see the look in Gul'dan's eyes when he learned that the rest of his Shadow Council had been destroyed. Not yet, Warchief, but the medicine woman says that he will awake soon, said Drak. Good. Bellowed Herkan Skullsplinter, chieftain of the Bone Chew clan and the only orc Drak had ever seen approach Ogrim's size. Finally that traitor can get what he deserves. I will enjoy watching him die. It will please me nearly as much as enjoying our victory over the humans. All the orcs who were not busy stuffing their mouths full of food, and many who were, broke into booming cheers at the chieftain's words. Earthsplitter, tell the medicine woman to send for me the moment that Gul'dan is awake, Ogrim ordered as soon as the cheers subsided. Yes, Warchief, Drak said obediently. Good. Come join our feast, said Ogrim. Loyal orcs like you should take the time to enjoy the spoils of war after a difficult victory. Thank you, Warchief, but I wish to return to helping the grunts clear out the city of human survivors, said Drak, refusing politely. The humans are clever, and there are still many who are hiding from my mace. Ha. Fine then, said Ogrim dismissively. Enjoy your hunting, Earthsplitter. Thank you, Warchief, said Drak as he bowed politely before leaving the way he came. Drak calmly made his way through the city, ignoring the sounds of humans being killed and orcs yelling in exhilaration, and started walking down a path that would lead him out of the city. It did not take very long for him to find himself alone and outside of Stormwind, especially since any orc who attempted to focus on him would immediately find their attention wandering elsewhere. Soon enough, Drak found himself secluded in the woods outside of the human city. After making certain that he was not being observed by any sapient minds, orc, human, or otherwise, Deathwing allowed himself to shed the skin of Drak Earthsplitter and take on his true form. Gone was the pitiful mortal form of a nondescript Blackrock orc warrior, and instead stood the towering form of Deathwing the Destroyer, leader of the Black Dragon Flight. A large part of him wished to release a bellowing roar after returning to his true form, but Deathwing pushed down the urge so as not to alert the Horde. Too much of his time had been spent wearing mortal guises as he manipulated the war between the humans and orcs to further the goals of his masters. Now was one of the rare few moments where Deathwing could spread his wings freely while he considered how he intended to move forward, and he was determined to make full use of it. Fortunately, things were going even better than Deathwing had expected. Not only had one of the more powerful mortal kingdoms been destroyed, but the Horde had begun to slip away from the control of the Burning Legion after they had culled the majority of their warlocks. All the better for his own masters to take control in the Burning Legion's stead. Deathwing chuffed out a short laugh as recalled how easy it was to prevent the rest of the mortal kingdoms from sending aid to Stormwind. All that he had needed to do was use the power that his masters had gifted him to bend the fragile mortal minds of a select few mortals while wearing his human guise. There had even been many who had been perfectly glad to ignore Stormwind's increasingly desperate pleas for aid, not needing to be manipulated at all. Unfortunately, the mortals of Stormwind had proven to be a formidable enemy and had weakened the Horde significantly despite their crushing defeat. After the Horde began marching north and the threat of them became increasingly obvious to the mortals, it would become impossible to stop them from uniting into a force that would overcome even the Horde's might. However, now that the Orc shaman to whom he had sent visions had gone to the Redridge Mountains with his clan and had succeeded in acquiring the Dragon Soul, all of Deathwing's plans were beginning to fall into place. Alexstrasza would almost certainly move to investigate the destruction of the wards that protected the Dragon's Soul and the lack of word from its former guardian, that Welperastres. And by doing so, she would soon fly directly into Deathwing's trap. Once Alexstrasza was safely within his grasp and subject to his whims, there would be absolutely nothing that could stop him. Just as Deathwing was about to lie down in a comfortable position from which he could gleefully enjoy his success and plan for the future, he suddenly felt the presence of his masters pushing into his mind. Deathwing soon found himself seeing images of what seemed to be a mortal ship approaching what he recognized as the lands belonging to the human kingdom of Lordaeron. Yet, while there were indeed humans on this ship as expected, there were also creatures that he only barely remembered. Nerubians? Why were the humans willingly carrying servants of my masters to Lordaeron? Deathwing winced in pain as he was immediately assaulted by the unmitigated wrath of one of his masters, the old god known as Yogg-Saron. Traitors. Deathwing could barely contain his shock as he processed what his master had just told him. Traitors? The creatures that had been born from his master's very blood had turned against them? Deathwing would have never believed that such a thing was possible if not for the fact that one of his masters had been the one to tell him so. From the moment that he had given himself to the old gods in order to free himself from the burden that had been placed on him by the Titans, Deathwing had known that there was no going back to the way things had been before. The fact that these insects had betrayed his masters filled Deathwing with a mix of complicated feelings that he did not wish to examine at this time. Forcibly pushing those feelings away, Deathwing settled down to ponder what this development meant for his future plans. He had not done any research into how Azjol-Nerub had fared since the War of the Ancients, but their impending contact with the Eastern Kingdoms would doubtlessly change things dramatically. Though in what way he was not sure. There was not much he could do about it for now, given that he needed to stay close to the Horde until the Orcs had finished learning how to wield the Dragon Soul and succeeded in capturing Alexstrasza, but after that, the creatures who had betrayed his masters and worked against their goals would need to be dealt with. Devon Everdorn thanked the grim-faced quartermaster as he was given his rations for the day, which were mostly just a few biscuits and a bit of fish. Today was a day of clear weather, so Devon decided to eat his rations on the deck, away from the many sick and injured who were situated below. For a ship that was nearly completely filled with people, things were depressingly silent. Everywhere that Devon went, he could see tear-covered faces and gazes staring off into the abyss. The priests and priestesses of the church were doing their best to tend to injuries and lift spirits, but they themselves were little better off than those they wished to help. Devon apologized to one of the guards after accidentally bumping into them, but they paid him no mind at all. A few months ago he would have been expected to hear the guard yell something like "Watch it, Nyfear," on a good day, but the human didn't even seem to have enough motivation to give him a dirty look, let alone insult him or worse. Not that he would still expect to be called a Nyfear after everything that had happened. People had too much on their minds nowadays to concern themselves with a half-elf, like the fact that a green-skinned horde of monsters had destroyed their whole kingdom and driven those they hadn't killed into exile. Devon found himself a comfortable enough position on the deck to sit down and enjoy his meal as much as he could. Devon had served as a scout in Stormwind's military since he had been old enough to join. He had fought for his kingdom during both the Gnoll War and the Gorabashi War, but while both the Gnolls and Trolls had been significant threats to the kingdom, they both paled in comparison to the Horde. When they had first received reports of large green-skinned creatures raiding the countryside, they had believed that they were being attacked by some new tribe of trolls, like the forest trolls up north. Once they realized that the Horde was a new threat that had never been seen before, they rallied the full strength of their kingdom to face them, certain that their enemies would fall beneath the might of their kingdom. How wrong they were. Now they were running north in the hope that the kingdoms there, who were happy to ignore Stormwind's plight before, would finally offer their aid and stand against the Horde that would no doubt soon turn their eyes north. Devon could almost feel the cloud of despair that was smothering what remained of the people of Stormwind as they sailed north. Devon turned his gaze to a certain, heavily guarded portion of the deck. Anduin Lothar, despite being a legendary figure in the kingdom, was barely distinguishable from any of the other despairing souls sailing away from their ruined home. Both the Crown Prince and Medivh's apprentice, who seems to have inexplicably aged several decades since Devon had last seen him several months ago, were not doing much better. All three of them looked as if their worlds had been ripped away from under their feet. Crown Prince Varian was obviously doing his best to put on a brave face, but Devon could easily see that the boy had recently been crying. He couldn't exactly blame either of them. The champion had watched as the kingdom he had sworn to protect burned to the ground, and the Crown Prince had lost both of his parents in a very short amount of time. There were even rumors that the boy had been there to watch the traitorous Orc Winch murder his father. He himself had also lost many of those he held dear to the Horde, and it was only the experiences he had gained living among those who lived such short lives that allowed him to push forward. Half-elves did not live the millennia that pure-blooded high elves could, but they still had lifespans that measured in the centuries, of which he was already in his second. Just as Devon was preparing to head back to his quarters after finishing his rations, his instincts alerted him to strange movements in the corner of his vision. Turning a sharp gaze earned through centuries of being a military scout, Devon immediately picked out what had drawn his attention. Standing near the entrance that led below deck was a bald old man with clear blue eyes and a pudgy build. Devon felt like he recognized him from somewhere, but was unable to immediately remember where. This, however, was not what had drawn his attention. What was strange about this man was that he was subtly flashing hand signals that should only be known to members of his scouting party. Devon stared at the features of the old human in an attempt to see if he was a retired veteran, but he came up blank no matter how much he searched his memories. Not only was Devon incredibly good with faces, but he had also personally known every scout who had joined Stormwind's military for much longer than the old man had been alive. As soon as Devon stood up to see what the stranger wanted, he quickly moved to head below deck. Devon did not want to cause a disturbance by running after him, and it wasn't as if the human had anywhere to run, so he simply casually followed the old man down into the ship. It was not very difficult to follow the human, and Devon soon found himself standing in front of a door to a cabin in a section of the ship that was suspiciously devoid of refugees. Devon knocked politely on the door, assuming that whoever organized this subterfuge had intentionally brought him here wished to meet with him. It did not take long for the door to be opened, revealing both the old man who he had been following and a figure he well recognized. Standing behind a desk filled with documents was an old human woman with a head full of white hair and an appearance that would not stick out in a crowd among the usual crones of the kingdom. The only thing that could be said to be notable about her was the grotesque amount of rings that she wore on each of her fingers, a habit which Devon knew that the woman had possessed since she was young. With a sigh of exasperation, Devon did not hesitate to walk into the room and close the door behind him. "Pathonia Shaw, to what do I owe the pleasure?" asked Devon, already finding himself tired of the conversation before it had even started. He had been subject to her near-constant invitations throughout the years, ever since she was a young up-and-coming knife for hire in the criminal underworld of Stormwind. This was long before the kingdom's leadership moved to organize its criminals into a guild that would secretly work in its service. Devon was honestly scared at the idea of how much the woman could get done if she had his lifespan, considering what she had already achieved in her own. "Everdawn, this is not another attempt to recruit you," said Pathonia Shaw, uncharacteristically straight to the point. I brought you here because both I and your kingdom need your help. Devon was surprised. He had never known the founder and leader of the Stormwind Assassins Guild to miss an opportunity to attempt to recruit him, or clearly state her intentions without first playing mind games. I suppose not even the Queen of Thieves and Killers can remain unaffected by what happened, Devon thought with a faint sorrow. What is it? Asked Devon. If she was willing to get to the point, then he would at least hear her out. Only Devon's sharp eyes allowed him to see the flicker of surprise that flashed across the old woman's face. I have an important mission which needs to be done, but for which I do not have an appropriate agent, said Pathonia entreatingly. Devon could see the tension in her frame as she expected the conversation to devolve into an argument, so he instead took a moment to consider her words. He had never approved of the kingdom's decision to use criminals to do its dirty work, but things were different now. Still, Devon could not allow his personal feelings on the matter to get in the way if his kingdom truly needed his help. If there was ever a time for the people of Stormwind to come together, then it was surely now. Very well, said Devon. I will hear you out, though I do not guarantee that I will agree to help you. Both Pathonia and the old man who had led him here let out a sigh of relief and lost much of the tension in their bodies. Thank you, Everdawn, said Pathonia, showing him a rare smile. Before I explain the mission to you, I would first like to give you some information that you may or may not know about what happened in the days leading up to Stormwind's destruction. Devon listened patiently as Pathonia told him about everything that had been happening among Stormwind's leadership during the later days of the war. Much of what she told him were things that he had already known, but others he had not. Many people knew that the king had been betrayed and killed by the half-orc female that he had kept by his side, but this was the first time that Devon had heard anything about court conjurer Medivh. Though it did make sense why the leadership was not eager to share that information given everyone's already low morale. After she was done telling him about what had happened, Pathonia finally told him the details about the mysterious mission that she wished to send him on. You want me to investigate Lordaeron's nobles and find out why we were not sent aid? Devon blurted out in surprise. That is correct, said Pathonia solemnly. The kingdom sent constant pleas for aid for several years to anyone who would listen, but there was not a single kingdom that was willing to help us no matter what we said, not even our closest allies. That isn't something that can be easily explained by the normal power games that happen between kingdoms. You suspect that our diplomatic efforts were sabotaged? Asked Devon through gritted teeth, fury growing quickly within him until he was feeling a wrath greater than he had ever felt in his long life. If somebody had prevented Stormwind from receiving aid from the other kingdoms, then they held a massive amount of responsibility for the kingdom's destruction and all the lives that had been lost. I suspect foul play, though I couldn't tell you why or how, said Pathonia, her voice colder than he had ever heard before. Devon was not the only one who could benefit from a target for his anger. However, if there is one thing that I have learned, it is that the consequences of failing to distinguish friend from foe are often catastrophic. Devon winced at the venom he could hear in the old woman's tone, certain that she blamed Lothar for failing to foresee the betrayal of Medivh and Garona. The two of them had always had an antagonist relationship, and Devon was certain that things had not improved now that the champion was Stormwind's regent ruler. Why not use one of your own agents? Or do this yourself? Devon asked curiously. My agents are either dead or not good enough, Pathonia said bluntly. Besides, Lothar does not trust the Assassin's Guild in the same way that King Lane did. He has already ordered for us to become more integrated into the kingdom's government. The Assassin's Guild will soon be reformed into SI-7, a covert organization that answers directly to the throne. Most of my time will be spent grooming my grandson, Matthias, to take over my position. Devon was not particularly surprised to hear that. Many in Stormwind's leadership had long held the opinion that the Assassin's Guild should be dissolved and its members put under the thumb of its rulers. It was also no secret that Matthias, who had very pointedly been pushed into becoming friends with the Crown Prince, was being groomed to lead such an organization. You are one of the few people outside of my organization who possesses the skills necessary to accomplish this. Something that might be needed if the sabotage came from within and we need to hide our movements from their eyes, Pathonia continued. Devon could believe that to be true. He had picked up a multitude of useful skills over his long life, after all. Devon did not have to think very long before nodding his agreement, causing both of the humans to smile in relief. As he and Pythonia spent the next few hours speaking over the details of the mission and going over which of Lordaeron's nobles he should investigate first, Devon could feel a fiery resolve grow within him. He had spent his entire life serving his kingdom by finding its enemies, so this was not much different. If there was indeed somebody who was responsible for preventing his kingdom from receiving aid in its time of greatest need, then he would not rest until he found them. And when he did, they would regret making an enemy of Stormwind. Krivax let out a grunt of frustration as he struggled to successfully construct the mental shields that Vizier Hadix claimed was standard learning for members of the Order of Kalchut. He had learned during the meeting with Azjol Nerub's leadership, and Hadix had confirmed that the seers were aware of a tide of death approaching their kingdom. Krivax knew that the tide of death referred to the Lich King, but the rest of Azjol Nerub had no idea what it meant, other than danger in the kingdom's future. As a result, Vizier Hadix was insistent on Krivax's continued study of magic, even while they were going on a diplomatic mission. Not that he was complaining. "Calm yourself," said Vizier Hadix from the other side of one of the cabins that Vizier Crenus had magically enlarged for them, his tone bored as he casually lounged in a silk hammock and read through some kind of spell book. "Arcane magic is fundamentally about order. Discipline your thoughts as you cast the spell. It is imperative that you are able to sense any influence the void might try to impose on your mind." Krivax fully understood the vizier's insistence that he learn to protect his thoughts and shared his concerns, but that did not make learning it any easier. If he was still in his old body, then there would be little chance that Krivax would be able to cast such esoteric magic at such a young age. Thankfully, it was no exaggeration to say that the transformation to his magical potential had been nearly as drastic as the change in his appearance. Not only was any magic he cast significantly more powerful, but Krivax found he could cast faster, think clearer, and display a greater degree of control as well. "Vizier Krivax. Focus," Hadix said chidingly. Krivax winced at the rebuke and redirected his attention to casting the spell. This was important and deserved his full and undivided attention. His previous attempts had failed, but he felt like he had learned enough to succeed in casting the spell this time. Doing his best to keep his thoughts as disciplined and orderly as possible, Krivax pulled on his magic as he imagined constructing a large Nerubian-style gate that would keep unwanted influence out of his mind. Krivax was more than a little surprised when he actually felt the spell successfully click into place. "Good," said Hadix approvingly. "Remember that it is not enough to build walls, but you must also place a sentry that will alert you should an outside influence attempt to probe your mind." Riding high on his success, Krivax pushed forward as he imagined his mental gate being patrolled by swarms of flyers and skitterers, only to wince at the pain that arrived after the spell backfired. "Do you understand what you did wrong?" asked Vizier Hadix, turning away from his book so he could point a chastising expression in Krivax's direction. "No, Vizier, everything seemed to be going well before the spell suddenly failed." Krivax crouched as he rubbed his aching head with all four of his hands. The backlash that came with a failed spell was no joke. "You attempted to place too many sentries. At your current skill level, you would be better off starting with one. Wait until the backlash fades and then try again." "Yes, Vizier." Just as Krivax was about to settle down in a comfortable spot as he waited for his headache to pass, the sound of knocking drew his attention to the cabin door. "I can sense that it is one of the human sailors," said Vizier Hadix with extreme disinterest. "Go answer the door, Vizier Krivax, before the human shows themselves in and attempts to speak to me." "Yes, Vizier," said Krivax, doing his best to hide his exasperation. Much of his time since they had set sail from Northrend had been spent handling speaking on behalf of the Nerubian delegation to those they did not wish to speak to themselves, which was most of the crew. Krivax approached the cabin door slowly, paying deliberate attention to his movements. Although he had mostly gotten used to his new body over the very long trip, he still felt the need to pay attention to his steps at times to compensate for his one less pair of legs. Krivax let out a huff of annoyance as he was forced to bend down to look through the door as he opened it. While Vizier Crenus was a genius who specialized in spatial magic, even she was limited in how much she could increase the size of the cabins without investing significant resources. If that weren't the case, then a Nerubian would not have been wrapped in silk and put into a magical sleep. "Yes? How can I help you?" Krivax asked the human sailor who did not look very comfortable to be speaking with him. "Yeah, Uck. The captain sent me to let you guys know that we're about to reach Fairwater Port, said the sailor whose name Krivax did not know. Despite his attempts over the course of the trip, most of the crew still actively avoided interacting with him as much as they did the other Nerubians if they could. A hurdle he was starting to realize might remain a problem once they actually reached the Eastern Kingdoms. "All right, thank you for letting us know," Krivax said simply. It was obvious that the guy really didn't want to be there, so he wouldn't insist on continuing the conversation. The sailor simply nodded while showing an expression of relief before quickly leaving. Krivax didn't bother to close the door since he and Hadix would be making their way up to the top deck now that they were finally about to reach the Eastern Kingdoms. The delegation had long since decided that there was no point in attempting to keep out of sight while the natives were forewarned about them like Krivax had done the previous times he had met new groups of people. After all, Spider Lord Anuba Khan and his cocoon would be visible long before they stepped into town. By the time Krivax had turned around, Vizier Hadix was already getting down from his hammock and making his way out of the cabin. "Let us not waste time," said Hadix. "I'd prefer to spend as little time on this wooden prison as possible." The journey had been a long one, and he knew for a fact that Vizier Hadix was not the only one who was feeling cooped up. Krivax kept his head down as he waddled through the two small hallways and was unsurprised to discover that the rest of the delegation had beaten them there once they arrived on deck. Walking past Vizier Krines, the pair of weavers, and many uncomfortable humans, Krivax greeted Masrook as he approached the group of warriors. "Hey, Masrook," said Krivax as he looked down toward his friend, still not completely adjusted to his change in height. "You feeling all right?" He knew that his friend had been feeling particularly cooped up and had coped by spending much of his time learning from the warriors. Still, his options for sparring and training were limited given their lack of space. "I am feeling better now that we are finally nearing our destination," Masrook grumbled with no small amount of frustration. "How about you? How has your training been going?" "Well enough. I've nearly managed to learn the spell that Vizier Hadix has been trying to teach me," said Krivax vaguely. He was obviously not able to tell Masrook about anything related to the order, but his friend did not seem to feel put out by his vague responses, thankfully. "Land ahoy." Krivax turned his gaze to the front of the ship at the captain's bellow to see Marzi and Trixie staring at something off in the distance. He had spent a lot of time with both the gnome and the dwarf while learning to speak common during the long trip. Krivax was grateful for his newfound mental acuity, otherwise he would not have learned enough common during the trip to carry a conversation. Although he was still feeling a bit put out over how much quicker Hadix learned common than he did. Damned centuries-old wizards and their absurd intelligence. "Hello, friends," said Krivax in common as he approached the two explorers. Once he got closer he could see that Malzi was using some kind of spyglass and Trixie was fiddling with her goggles. "How are things looking in town?" "Not well, lad," said Malzi, his tone grim as he stared off into the distance. "The dock workers have seen you and the rest of the spiderfolk with their own spyglasses. Looks like they're panicking and guards are forming up around the docks." Krivax winced at the news. While that was a potential possibility that they had considered, it was one that he had hoped to avoid. If the humans were panicking, then there was a possibility that they would refuse to allow them to port or even attack them outright. It was a small possibility given that the ship was still being visibly sailed by humans, but Krivax did not trust these people to make rational decisions when a ship covered in unknown giant spider creatures was approaching their town. "Will you be going ahead with Vizier Hadix?" asked Masrook, referring to the plan that they and the rest of the delegation had come up with when they discussed possible responses to a situation like this one. Vizier Hadix was the one who was nominally responsible for the actual diplomacy, although Krivax suspected that his mentor had no interest in speaking to primitives and intended to leave as much of that work as possible to him. "Yes, I suppose I will," Krivax answered reluctantly. Hadix's response on what they should do if the humans reacted with hostility before they docked was simply for him, Krivax, and a representative from the ship to teleport ahead and cow them with a round of good vizier/bad vizier. That is to say, Krivax and the representative would be the ones who would actually be diplomatic while Hadix provided the threat of magical violence. After all, it had not escaped the notice of the viziers that the humans were even more cautious around them than the other members of the delegation who had not displayed any magical skill. It was confirmed by Trixie that most human mages lived in Dalaran and that the majority of the sailors had likely never even met someone who used magic before. They had considered many options of who they should bring along, but they eventually settled on Oscar given that he was directly employed by House Ashford and was well trusted by them. "Nobody is going to get hurt, right?" Trixie asked in concern. While she knew Krivax well enough to assume that he would not hurt anyone, she didn't have as much confidence in Vizier Hadix. "Of course not," said Krivax with more confidence than he really felt. Logically, it should be fine given that Hadix was smart enough to understand that harming any of the humans would make their job much harder. Still, he knew that the Vizier placed very little thought into the well-being of humans, so a part of him was still worried. Resigning himself to his upcoming confrontation with a group of armed and scared people, Krivax went to gather Oscar, who was busy chattering with the captain. After explaining the situation to them, Oscar promptly agreed to follow him and the two of them began making their way over to Hadix and Krenus, who both seemed to be engrossed in some kind of conversation. Krivax was only able to hear the tail end of what Vizier Krenus was saying once he got closer. Something very strange about the effect this land has on spatial magic. Could it be due to the ley lines? I am unsure. I have done a few calculations and the source of the disruptive emanations is likely coming from somewhere in the southern portion of the continent. Will it prevent us from creating a permanent portal if the leadership decides doing so is in the interests of the kingdom? It's too early to tell. Vizier Hadix, Vizier Krenus, I'm sorry for interrupting, but it seems that the humans in the town ahead have started to panic due to our presence, said Krivax, knowing from experience that if he did not interrupt that they would simply ignore him and continue speaking as if he wasn't there. TCH. How inconvenient, said Hadix with a note of irritation. We will continue this conversation later, Vizier Krenus. I will teleport ahead alongside my student to make certain the humans do not do anything foolish while the ship is approaching. After we dock and a new Bakan has been awoken, I doubt that the humans will have enough bravery to threaten us. Seeing no reason to wait and not wanting to give the humans more time to prepare, Vizier Hadix placed a hand on the shoulders of both Krivax and Oscar, turned his gaze to the docks, and began casting the short-range teleportation spell. Come on, Vizier Hadix. At least warn me first. Krivax grumbled quietly to himself as he was suddenly teleported without warning onto the town of Fairwater's docks, right in front of a crowd of startled and panicking human guards and a few makeshift militia. Krivax had not been able to get a good look at the town from the boat given the distance, but he was surprised to find that it was a bit larger than he had been expecting. Unfortunately, he was not given much time to catch his bearings or get a good look at the town in detail before some of the guards decided to immediately open fire on them with a few of their guns, causing Oscar to scream out in fright. Thankfully, Vizier Hadix had created an arcane barrier around their persons the moment they teleported in and the bullets bounced off harmlessly without leaving a scratch, much to the dismay of the human guards. Their weapons are a bit stronger than I had expected, muttered Vizier Hadix with some interest. Azjol Nerub had of course learned about guns from Trixie, but it was not easy for them to conceptualize something they had never seen before. Seeing that Oscar was too frightened about being shot at to take control of the situation, Krivax decided it would be better to get ahead of everything before the situation devolved even more than it had. Greetings. Krivax yelled out in common as loud so that he could be heard over the clamor. Thankfully, that seemed to be enough to stun the panicking guards and militia, freezing their attempts for a follow-up attack for the moment from shock. I am Vizier Krivax of Azjol Nerub. I have been told that the ruler of this town is Lord Uland Ashford. I would like to speak with you about my people's presence on the sea cutter. After he started yelling out in common, the humans seemed to freeze in astonishment, but once he mentioned the name of the local lord, they all simultaneously turned their gaze to one particular person in the crowd. Even if that was not enough of a clue, Krivax would have been able to tell that the middle-aged man who was currently mounted on a large war horse and was wearing ornate armor was likely to be Lord Uland Ashford. Once he was called out, the noble did not hesitate to move forward to the edge of the arcane barrier and turn a steely gaze to Krivax, not looking at all intimidated by the giant spider wizards in front of him. Who and what are you, creature? Said Lord Ashford. Why have you come here? As I said, I am Vizier Krivax of Azjol Nerub, a kingdom native to Northrend. This is Vizier Hadix, said Krivax as diplomatically as possible, gesturing toward Hadix. We are Nerubians, and our people have sent us to establish diplomatic contact between our kingdom and those of the Eastern kingdoms. Krivax made sure to speak loudly enough for all the nearby humans to hear him, and they all immediately broke out into chatter at his words. Lord Ashford seemed stunned at his words and took several moments to contemplate in silence for responding. "What have you done to the crew of the ship that we sent to Northrend, Nerubian? Are they well?" asked Lord Ashford in a steely tone, turning a gaze to the merchant who was just starting to compose himself. "If you have harmed them, then I swear on the light that your magic will not stop me from making you regret it." Vizier Haedix scoffed in disdain before responding to the human lord with a voice filled with derision. "Mind your words, human, before I teach you how wrong you are. My magic is not something that your pitiful little militia nor your meager light is capable of overcoming." After hearing those words, Lord Ashford turned a wary eye toward Haedix, and many of the humans tensed and tightened their grips on their weapons. "Damn it, Haedix." Just as Krivax was about to try his best to smooth over the situation, Oscar finally recovered from his fright and stepped forward. "Lord Ashford, please tell your men to stand down. There is truly no need for violence," Oscar said pleadingly. "The Nerubians have not treated us poorly. The crew is safe and they have come here with good intentions." Lord Ashford looked at Oscar with an assessing gaze and was silent for several moments before turning his attention back to Krivax. "If what you say is true, then I would speak with my retainer in private to verify your claims." "Of course," said Krivax with a note of relief, agreeing immediately. It was a reasonable request, and they truly had nothing to hide. That Oscar knew about anyway. With a wave of his hand, Vizier Haedix opened up a small hole in the barrier that allowed Oscar to pass through before closing it again immediately afterward, not trusting the local humans not to have itchy trigger fingers. Krivax watched as the merchant and the lord walked away from everyone else and began speaking to each other in hushed whispers. The two of them were speaking for quite some time, and it seemed like their conversation was progressively devolving into an argument until Oscar opened up his spatial bag and showed its contents to Lord Ashford. The human noble seemed stunned but quickly collected himself before restarting their conversation in a more subdued manner. Eventually, the two of them finished their conversation, and Lord Ashford walked back over to them. "We will allow the sea cutter to dock, but your people must stay on the ship until we have finished verifying your story," Lord Ashford said reluctantly. "Thank you, Lord Ashford," said Krivax, bowing politely. Haedix simply scoffed before taking down the barrier, although Krivax was not naive enough to believe that the vizier was not prepared for an attack. "I look forward to building trust between our people and House Ashford." "We shall see, Nerubian," said Lord Ashford with audible skepticism. "We will continue this conversation in my keep after the ship has docked and the crew has been interviewed. You will remain under armed guard during this process." Vizier Haedix let out a huff of annoyance but didn't say anything to contradict the human's terms. While the vizier was more than a little arrogant, he was also intelligent enough to understand when it was best to compromise. "We understand, Lord Ashford," said Krivax politely. "We will remain aboard the ship while you verify our claims. We look forward to continuing this conversation later so that we might reach a greater understanding." "Good," said Lord Ashford sternly. "I will hold you to that. Now if you would excuse me, I must return to my keep to speak with my advisors about these developments." Lord Ashford turned to one of the men who Krivax assumed to be some kind of commander and instructed them to allow the ship to dock and interview every member of its crew. Once he was done with that, the human lord glanced at them one final time before making his way deeper into the town with Oscar quietly following behind him. "That could have gone better. But I suppose it could have gone worse." Krivax had already reached the conclusion that the humans would not react well to the Nerubians, but that level of hostility was difficult to handle. It would be much more difficult to form a friendly relationship between them and Azjol Nerub than it was to form one with the Tuskar. As the guards and militia moved to carry out the orders of Lord Ashford, while continuing to glance fearfully at the two viziers, Krivax resigned himself to the fact that this was going to be a much more difficult task than he had hoped.